All right. In Catechism, the very first topic that Luther covers is the Ten Commandments, to establish the fact that God's in charge. God is the one who tells us what to do and what not to do, and we need to know what He's told us to do. If we don't know the requirements, then we don't understand how far short we fall of the requirements. We don't understand that we need a Savior from our sin if we don't know what the sins are. So Luther tackles the Ten Commandments, and you'll notice on that very first page he says the Ten Commandments, as the head of the household, should teach them in a simple way to his family. Luther's catechism was not written for use inside the church organization so much as it was written as a guide for fathers to teach their children what God said you should do and not do. The Ten Commandments are very interesting. They are recorded for us in Exodus chapter 20. And when you look at the Ten Commandments, the first thing that pops out is that they're in a context. And the context was that God had already rescued the children of Israel out of Egypt. He'd already led them through the Red Sea. There had been the miracles in the desert as they were on their way, and now they're at Mount Sinai. And the whole of Exodus chapter 19 tells us about the preparations, that God set up this mountain as a place where He was coming to meet His people, and so the whole mountain was considered holy, set apart, sacred. They fenced it off so no one could touch it. Even the animals weren't allowed to touch the mountain as God came down to talk to His people. But when you read that story, as you read chapter 19, Moses goes up and God gives him some further instructions. Then Moses comes down and he's with the people when God gives the Ten Commandments. And as you read into chapter 20 at the end, you realize they heard God give the Ten Commandments. They didn't send Moses up, he got them and brought them back to them. They heard God give the Ten Commandments. So these words were spoken in the hearing of all the people of Israel. When God got done, the people said to Moses, Moses, in the future, you talk to God. Let God talk to you. If we hear that voice again, we will die. Okay? That's what they said. The point being, God tells them Himself, no intermediaries of any kind, this is how my people live. And that's how the Ten Commandments are worded. In fact, when we say the Ten Commandments, it's a very interesting thing. We say the Ten Commandments, and we number them as Lutherans. We number them the same way that Episcopalians, Roman Catholics would number them. And I'm going to put that numbering system up here. We're going to do the two, God later put them onto tablets of stone. And the way Lutherans and Roman Catholics and others number them is like that. The way other Protestants in the United States number them, I'm going to say, is like this. And the way that the Jewish people number them is like this. Okay, so this is the numbering system that matches what you have in the Catechism. You shall have no other gods. You shall not take the name of the Lord in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. honor your father and your mother, don't kill, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't bear false witness, don't covet your neighbor's house, don't covet your neighbor's wife, servants, cattle, and so forth. American Protestantism numbers them this way. You shall have no other gods. You shall not make any idols. And then the same, don't take my name in vain, remember the Sabbath day, and so forth. And then, because they've inserted an extra one here, they combine 9 and 10. And this is all the don't covet. Don't covet house, wife, servants, cattle, all of it all in one. The Jewish people number it a little differently. They start off with the first thing you'll find in Exodus 20, which is this: I am the Lord your God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Then what they would call number 2 is what we would call number 1. You shall have no other gods. And it's, and the numbering is off like this. And again, they combine 9 and 10. Now the reason I point that out is this right here. The first, and by the way, in the Bible, they're not called the 10 Commandments. They're called the 10 words. We'll do a little Hebrew here. They're called the 10 Devarim. The 10 sayings, the 10 things that came out of God's mouth. Not called the 10 Commandments. When you look at it in your English translation, it'll say the 10 Commandments because that's how you know them. But if you look in the Hebrew, it's the 10 words from God. Because the first one is obviously not a commandment, it's a statement. I am your God and I rescued you. None of the others are commandments either. Because if you think about it, what does God say? If you memorized it back in the old King James, thou shalt have no other gods before me. And we hear that language and we think, there's a commandment. It's not an imperative voice. It's indicative. It's in just plain what you would call imperfect in Hebrew. It's simply it's just a statement. That's all it is. God says, I rescued you. You belong to me. This is how you will live. It's the direct consequence of God's rescue. Remember when I talked about the third use of the law? How do I please God? Because He has saved me, because He loves me, I want to serve Him. What do? That's how the 10 Commandments are actually given in the Bible. They simply describe the way that a person who belongs to God and who has been rescued by God will live their life. A person who has been rescued by the God who created the heavens and the earth is not going to have any other gods. They're not going to use His name in vain. They are going to respect the Sabbath day. They're going to respect their parents. They're not going to kill other people. They're not going to break their marriage vows. They're not going to steal. They're not going to lie. And they're not going to want the things that don't belong to them. That's what God said. That's how you will live. This is what I have done. This is how you will live. We call them the 10 Commandments in part because if there were such a thing as an imperative statement, these would be the things that would be there. And Hebrew does, by the way, have an imperative voice. It could be worded, do this. That's how we do it in English. We just say, do, go, stop, whatever, and we put an exclamation point after it. That's the way you do imperative voice in English. In Hebrew, there's a construction that could be used, but it's not used. This is, you are my people, I have rescued you, this is how you will live. Simple statement of fact. So that's how the 10 Commandments are given to us. That doesn't mean that they don't have the force of law. Because when God describes how it should be, it's God describing it. Consequently, it has the force of law. But it's just very interesting how he chooses to word it. So what I want to do in these next few minutes is talk about the first table of the law. The reason that in Christian art you will see the commandments numbered on two. If you see, usually it's in Roman numerals, you'll see either 1, 2, 3 on the first tablet and 4 through 10 on the second, or 1, 2, 3, 4 on the first one, 5 through 10, depending on if it's, again, Lutheran, Roman Catholic, and so forth, or if it's American Protestantism. In American Protestantism, 1A there is treated as a separate commandment because of the things that happened during the Reformation. Much of American Protestantism comes out of the tradition that rejected all Christian art during the Reformation. They broke the stained glass windows, they tore down the statues and the paintings, and and everything was bare. If you had walked into a Baptist or Presbyterian or many denominations in the United States back in the 1950s, you would not have seen much, if any, Christian art. You wouldn't have even seen a cross. You certainly wouldn't have seen a crucifix. You wouldn't have seen any kind of statuary. You probably wouldn't see figures in stained glass, although you might see geometric patterns or something. You wouldn't see a cross on a steeple. You would see a weather vane, right? The good old New England churches with the weather vane on the steeple. That's because they rejected any depictions, and out of that came the idea that they would number the commandments then in a hybrid between the Jewish numbering, which combines 9 and 10, and the Roman Catholic numbering, which starts at what we call 1 and would have been 2 to the Jews. They divided commandment number 1 into 2 parts. You shall have no other gods, and very specifically they said, don't make any images, don't make any graven images. So what we consider to be commentary on the first commandment, they separated out and made it the second commandment. So if you're reading some Christian devotional book and get confused about which commandment they're talking about, that's going to be the reason why, and now you know the answer. And I've talked about it already more than I should have. But this first table of the law then, really the commandments break into 2 identifiable parts. The first 3 commandments talk about our relationship directly with God, and the other commandments talk about our relationship with each other. We are not to have any other gods, we're not to take his name in vain, we are to remember his Sabbath and keep it holy. That's our relationship with God. We're to honor our parents, we're not to kill, we're not to steal, we're not to commit adultery, all those things. That's our relationship with other human beings. If you want to try and picture it, what we're talking about is cross-shaped. There is the vertical relationship between God and us. There's a horizontal relationship between one human and another. So everything that we do is going one direction or the other, but it has to come together. If we don't keep our lives cross-shaped, if we don't share our love both with God and with each other, then life gets out of balance. You would, if you said, I'm going to devote myself entirely to God and have nothing to do with other human beings, which to some extent was like the monastery back in the Middle Ages. You might think that way I'll have a better relationship with God. But there's a problem. Again, I'm imagining how God might want me to do things. What God says is that I'm not allowed to do that. I'm not allowed to just only spend time with Him. He's called me to spend time with my neighbor. Then there's the other problem, which comes up, and you say, well, the Christian faith is really all about taking care of other people, and that's what I'm going to spend my time doing, and I'm going to completely, I'm not going to spend any time, I'm not going to waste time on things like prayer and worship and things like that. I'm just going to help other people. Again, your life is out of balance. God says it's got to be both things, always going, cross-shaped life. So for us, it's very important for us to gather together in worship, to talk to each other about God and His call on our lives, and to worship and praise Him. And it's important to go back out the doors and get out into this world that God has called us to serve Him in. Both things have to be happening. So, but we're going to concentrate in the next few minutes on the first table of the law, the first 3 commandments. What Luther does is he looks at the commandments themselves, and he looks all through the Bible for everything that pertains to those commandments, and then he summarizes it. He squeezes it down into something that's easily memorized. With the first commandment, you shall have no other gods, Luther says we should fear, love, and trust in God above all things. Now, that sounds very simple, and it is very simple, but oh my goodness, he's gone all over the Bible to condense that down. He's looking at Old Testament and New Testament alike to come up with that. He says that to have a God is to consider some being to be higher up than you, to be in some way, shape, or form responsible for you, for your creation, looking, it's the most important thing that's there. It governs your life. So what God is saying in this commandment is that He's the one who occupies that position, nobody else. But to have a God doesn't necessarily mean to have the real God. You can have any number of things occupying that number one position in your life. Most people have some real passion somewhere in their lives. You can turn your passion into your God. That's the warning. See, here's the problem. We look at this first commandment by itself, you shall have no other gods, and we say, heck, that's easy. I've never bowed down and worshipped, a statue of Buddha or something. I never even been tempted to worship an idol, so fine. The only person I've ever said is God, so I've got that covered. No problem with the first commandment. Luther says, essentially, oh really? Well, let's talk about this. Fear, love, and trust in God above all things. What do you fear? Understand that when the Bible uses the word fear, in both Greek and Hebrew, the word that's used comes out kind of halfway between our English word fear and our word respect. Okay, if you could imagine a word that was halfway between those two words, that would be the Greek or the Hebrew word that Luther is using when he says fear as well. So I would say that it would be correct in that biblical understanding to say, I fear electricity. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm scared to touch the light switch. It does mean that I'm not going to walk up to 2 bare wires and grab them like that. Or, see a power line down out in the street and step on it, or, you know. There's a difference between those two things. I respect the power of electricity. I'm not terrified of it. I don't think it's out to get me, but I do know that it could hurt me if it's not properly respected. So, you know, that's kind of a rough beginning at this understanding of fearing God. We're not, you know, terrified that God hates me and he's out to get me. On the other hand, he's not simply my buddy, you know. He's not my equal, certainly. He is incredibly powerful. He makes very real demands on my life. He does care about our relationship and has the power to do whatever he needs to do to make that relationship right. And consequently, I understand who he is compared to me. But what happens is that people will fear other things besides God. They'll put him in that same kind of relationship. People can fear poverty so much that it drives everything that they do. They're afraid they'll lose what they've got. I watched a guy do this once. It's one of the few people I've ever known that actually hit a lottery jackpot of some kind. And it wasn't enough money for him to just sit back for the rest of his days and do absolutely nothing. But it was enough that he was afraid to lose it. Actually, it was his wife who had died. He was widowed. She'd actually won the money. And the first thing he did was to make sure that her children from her first marriage didn't get their hands on it. You know, that had to be right away when she died. He made sure that the will was all properly administered because he didn't want them to get any of it. And then he sort of fell in love with a lady from my congregation. And as we went through the premarital counseling, I knew it was trouble. He was so wrapped up in preserving that money that he kept her at a distance. He wanted some things from her, but he didn't really want her close enough where she might get a hold of some of his money. And through that whole time, I kept warning them. I talked with him again and again. I did perform the marriage service, but with reservations. And sure enough, within a year, he just, and she loved him. And he did not deserve it, let me tell you. Like most men, you know, he didn't deserve it. But he wouldn't let it. That money turned into his God. He was afraid of losing it. So afraid of losing it that he wouldn't use it. And it just ruined his life. Just wrecked it. There are so many ways of adopting gods other than the real God, and human beings do it all the time. You could also take what I just said about that particular man and talk about Luther's second category, love. Boy, did he love that money. And because of it, he loved it above everything and everybody else, and consequently would not use it the way God said to use it. And like I say, would not let her get any, and she did. She really didn't care about the money. That was what was so ironic about it. This man, who didn't deserve any woman to love him, had a very nice lady who wanted to love him. He wouldn't let it happen. When he wouldn't keep God's law, it wrecked his life. You know, there are so many things that you can love above God. And when I say above God, you can't just put it in the simple terms of comparison. Do you love God more than you love your money? We just talked about that. Do you love God more than you love your recreation time? You know, a lot of people never come to church because they love their pillow more than they love God. You know, I mean, it's just a simple fact. It just amazes me when people say, well, Pastor, you know, I'd love to come to church, but Sunday's the only day I get to sleep in. And they think that I'm going to say, oh, well then, you know, that's fine. Well, I understand that. No, I don't. They're simply telling me that they're breaking the first commandment. That's all they're doing. You know, how many different things do people love as opposed to loving God the way that God says we should love Him? And of course, if we're going to talk about love, we have to start with God's love for us. That's what really defines love. And again, if this was a class where we talked about everything, we would spend quite a bit of time talking about that. We will get into it a little bit next week. And trust in God above all things. You know, go back to that insurance agent that I was talking to you about. There are an awful lot of people who do misuse insurance and bank accounts and investments and things like that. Their basic idea is, I'm going to protect myself so that nothing can affect me. No matter what happens, I'm going to be financially secure. You can use financial instruments to attempt to protect yourself even from acts of God. So while, you know, insurance and investments can be fine stewardship tools, they can also be sinful attempts to replace God. Well, I'm just trying to scratch the surface of this. The thing is that if you really spend a lot of time on the first commandment, instead of saying, oh, that's the easy one, I never bow down to an idol, you wind up with, oh my goodness, all day, every day, what am I doing? How am I really relating to the God who created me and has this, you know, claim on my life? Second commandment is probably the one that's the most conspicuously broken the most often every day. You know, I'm sitting here and, oh God, I dropped my piece of paper. Now, tell me, in what way did I need to talk to God about dropping that piece of paper? Was that a prayer? Was that offering worship to God? Was that telling other people about God? You know, go through the list of the ways you should use God's name. Did that actually incorporate any of those? I don't think so. Or worse, God damn that slippery piece of paper. Okay? Now, tell me, why should God send that piece of paper to hell? Why did I just pray to God and ask Him to send that piece of paper to hell? Because you see, that's, if I said that thing, then that's what I'm doing. Does that make any sense? That's what I say. That's the most conspicuously broken of all the commandments. Billions of times per minute over the face of the earth. People are taking God's name on their lips and doing nothing with it. And when I say doing nothing, I'm spelling nothing kind of with a capital N. I'm doing a something that's really a nothing. I'm taking it in vain. That's what the commandment warns against. And the reason that it does that is because God's name actually means something. If if you look in your Hebrew Bible, you'll find that that's the name of God that's talked about in the commandment. If you were to put it into English, it would come out something like Yahweh. Okay? And if you were to add the vowel sounds, it would look something like that in Hebrew. Now, the Jewish people were so concerned that they wouldn't say Yahweh wrongly that they wound up never saying it at all. And here's what they did. When they saw the word Yahweh in their Hebrew Bible, they said this word instead. They said the word Adonai. Which is the Hebrew word for Lord. And that's why in your English translation, wherever this occurs, it will say the Lord. And you'll notice that in English translations, it's written this way, as opposed to this way, or this way, with small caps. That's to show you that it's actually translating this word. If it's written this way or this way, it's translating this word here, okay? Which is just the word for Lord. Like the English use the word Lord so-and-so, you know, Lord Mountbatten, you know, he's a person who has this ruling responsibility. So the Jewish people stopped saying Yahweh centuries ago and replaced it with Adonai because they were afraid to say God's name at all, because they might be saying it wrongly. Well, that's not what God wanted them to do. We are supposed to take the name of the Lord our God onto our lips to pray to Him, to worship Him, to tell other people about Him. That's fine. To call upon Him in times of trouble. You know, Luther says to call upon Him in times of trouble, pray, praise, and give thanks. But we're not to use His name to lie, you know. Okay. Watch this. Here's what we'll say. I'll look over here and I'll say, I'll swear that that red marker is here somewhere. Okay? How many times a day do we swear to something that we know is not true? I swear I put my keys on the kitchen counter, we'll say. But they're not there. We know that they're not there. We're swearing to a lie. You know, we're really very odd. Or we'll even say, swear to God, you know. But it's not there. The crazy things we do. So God says, don't do those kind of things. Don't tell lies by my name. Don't call on my name to conjure up evil spirits or something like that. There's a whole list of things we shouldn't do. But we should call to God in times of trouble. I don't know if you've ever really been in a horrible situation. I remember I had to kick in a door and go into a burning house and carry a man out of the house. Let me tell you something. When I said God, there, I was talking to Him. I wanted Him there with me. I didn't need to say anything else. I just needed God there. Now, this name of God is His personal name, Yahweh. Even though they were afraid to say it. And by the way, let me just show you a little interesting thing. If you put the vowels, I'm sorry, that doesn't belong there. If you put the vowels from Adonai with the consonants of Yahweh, which is what they did. They, to remind them not to say Yahweh by mistake, they stuck the vowels from Adonai there, because they certainly weren't going to change the actual letters of the Bible. That would be, I mean, the Hebrew people would never have done anything like that. But it looks like a word, because you got consonants and vowels. Well, it's not a word, but if you try to say it, it comes out as Yehovah. Jehovah, if you want to put it into English letters. It's not even a word. But next time the Jehovah's Witnesses knock on your door and tell you that Jehovah is the only name for God, the curious thing is that it's not even a word. It's a made-up word that takes the vowels from one word, the consonants for another, warns you not to say this word. It's just a total fabrication. One of the gentle ironies of what happens when you go crazy places with with your thinking. Well, anyway, Yahweh is the name of God. When Moses meets God at the burning bush, God meets Moses at the burning bush, Moses says, okay, you want me to go and tell the children of Israel that God is calling them out of Egypt and going to rescue them. They're going to say, what God? You know, because the Egyptians had lots of gods. And Moses says, what should I tell them? And what God said was, tell them, oops, sorry. Don't want to misspell anything in front of you here. God said, tell them, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. I am that I am. Tell them, I am sent you. Well, I know you don't know any Hebrew, but this is at the heart of this existence. Am, I am, the verb to be, is at the heart of the name of God. When God speaks his name, he's talking about his existence. And if you get, really philosophical and try and think things through and look around, look at your body, look at the world around you and say, how did this ever come to be in the first place? How is there such a thing as space and time and matter and things like that? I mean, you can go crazy thinking about things like that. That is the center of it all. God who exists versus not existing. And again, if we had time to really talk through all of this, we could spend hours on that question. My point is simply this, that the name of God is wrapped up in existence itself, in there being anything. And then what do? We use it to mean nothing. And in fact, if you were to complain, if you said to someone, please stop saying Jesus all the time when you've dropped your pencil or whatever, oh Jesus, that's my Jesus, and please don't do that. They'll say, oh, I don't mean anything by it. Well, that's the problem. That's what God said not to do, is to not mean anything when you call his name. When you say Jesus, up in heaven, he's saying, yes, how can I help you? What is your need? Think of how you would feel. Of course, any mother knows how you would feel. Mom! What? Mom! What? Mom! And nothing, yeah, a kid can drive you crazy like that. Well, this is happening to God billions of times per minute. People are saying his name and not talking to him. If you open your mouth with God's name, it should be because you're in trouble and you're praying to him, because you're praising him for the good things that he's done, because you are sharing the truth about him with someone else. Any other use, God says, don't do that. My people don't do that, is what God really says. The people that I've rescued, the people who belong to me, don't talk that way. If they say my name, they're talking to me, or they're telling good things about me. So, when you start to go after the commandments, you see, all of a sudden, you bump into this very real God who really knows what he wants and tells us what he wants. And the things that we just do by habit, most people who use God's name in vain, it's just a habit, and that's what they'll say. It's just a habit. Yeah, that's the problem. God says, don't have a habit like that. My people don't have habits like that. Stop it. Now this is what I was talking about earlier when I was talking about you don't back down. When God says this is the way I want it, well, that's the way he wants it. We don't have the option of saying, well, God doesn't mind if you do that a few times or something. No, Jesus had to die on the cross because of any one time that's happened. If you really believe in God, if you really believe what the Bible says about him, you would stop doing this thing that we're talking about. So breaking this commandment means either I don't believe these things, or I'm not listening to God, or I just won't pay attention to him. It means that my life is pulled away from his life. And of course, for the Christian, that's something we know is not good for us. And so we say, I got to stop doing that. No more of that in my life. Third commandment, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. This one deserves more time than we're probably going to give it, but let me see how quickly I can do this. The word Sabbath is the Hebrew word for seven. Okay, seven or seventh. The seventh day, one day out of every seven, God says, you make that day holy among yourselves. And he, very specifically says that a big part of making a day holy is not to work in it. That seems rather odd, because God has given us work to do, and blessed that work and made it holy. There is a holiness to good, honest labor, especially when we're laboring to help our neighbors around us. But God says, keep it holy, rest on that day. Set it apart. That's really what's at the heart of holy, is set apart, separated. How does resting fit into that concept? Well, number one, God said do it. I mean, that's an important part of this. But we think about it a little bit. The perfect relationship with God is to be constantly together with him. And that's what's promised to us when we die in the faith, is to be perfectly, forever with God. No breaks, no separation. Us and him, we're together. When Adam and Eve were first created, their lives were to be patterned after creation itself. They were instructed to take care of the earth, to tend the fields and pick the fruit and things like that. Their work was a joy. It wasn't all hampered like ours is by sin and the effects of sin. But even there was this idea of resting. When you explore that idea through the scriptures, you find it, number one, connected with heaven. Number two, or maybe tied for number one, it's connected with God being the one who really provides for us. And we could spend a lot more time developing this, and I'd be happy to, again, answer questions, especially by email for those who have them, that want to really explore things further. But essentially it works like this. God told me that I should work 6 days and rest one, work 6, rest one, work 6, rest one. That should be the pattern of my life. And that on that one day, I should be thinking about Him and His promise of eternal rest in heaven. When I say, oh, I can't do that, I can't take 1 day out of 7 because I have to work. If I don't, then I won't have enough to take care of my family. What I'm really saying is this: God can't support me. I have to do it myself. Now, God has told us that the way He supports us is through our labor, 6 days out of 7. When we pick a way to support ourselves, we may pick 7 days out of 7. So we're saying no to God's way of providing for us. Or we're saying this: God won't provide me as much as I want if I only work 6 days instead of 7. So in other words, God has a level at which He wants me to live, and I want to live at a different level, financial level. And see what starts to happen when you start to explore this Sabbath rest idea is that you bump up against the fact that that God has determined long ago what level of worldly goods He wants us to manage. And that level of worldly goods that He wants us to manage may not be the same level that we would choose ourselves. Which level is going to be best for me as a human being, as a child of God? Well, I would say it's the level that God has chosen for me. When I refuse to take time to rest, I'm saying, God, this can't be done your way. I've got to do it my way. It's really troublesome. Really troublesome. So, what do we do instead? Well, we say, okay, let's explore this. What should I be doing 1 day out of 7? Now, whether it's on the 7th day according to the calendar, which would be Saturday or not, is another question. And I want to just touch on that very briefly. The Pharisees in Jesus' time were always getting into fights with Jesus about the Sabbath day. Jesus would heal people on the Sabbath day, or His disciples would go through the fields, pluck some grain, and roll it out in their hands, blow the chaff away, and eat the grain. Okay? And the Pharisees said, oh, that's working. That's working. They should be resting on the Sabbath day. The Pharisees had decided, getting back to the concept of God's law, the Pharisees had decided that God gave through the written law and the oral law 613 rules for living. Now, you might say, 613. It is a prime number, by the way. Check that out if you want to. So it can't be divided into groups. 613 individual laws. You can't divide it evenly into groups. They said these rules, some of which Moses wrote down and some of which he passed down orally tell you how you ought to behave, how you ought to live. And one of those rules was that you could only walk a distance that's about the equivalent of half a mile on the Sabbath day. I mean, obviously, you can't not walk, from the bedroom to the bathroom or whatever. You got to move some. So they said, if it's more than a half a mile, then it's work. Up to that limit, it's not work. They said you couldn't heal on the Sabbath day because that was work for a doctor. And that's where they ran into trouble with Jesus, not understanding that Jesus healed a little differently than a doctor does. And in fact, doctors don't heal at all. Doctors do certain technical things with chemicals and with scalpels and things like that. God's the only one who heals. The doctor finishes and he sews you up, and then what happens? You wait while your body actually knits back together, because God is the one who's healing you. He's used the doctor as his assistant, but there's no healing done. But Jesus actually healed. He just healed people. He wasn't functioning as a doctor. All right, so anyhow, the Pharisees were always fussing with Jesus about these rules that they had in place, and Jesus was always saying, you're wrong, you don't understand, you don't get what's going on about the Sabbath. If you read through the Gospels, you could say that Jesus systematically destroyed the Pharisees' conception of the Sabbath day. He set out to do that, worked diligently at it, and accomplished it. So their concept of how you kept the Sabbath, he wipes out. And then Jesus replaces it. And let me show you how he does it. All right. This is a scale from 1 to 10. These are days of the week. We're going to start on a Sunday, first day of the week. This happens to be Palm Sunday that we're going to start. And this scale is measuring, if you and I are disciples of Jesus, how do we feel on a scale of 1 to 10 on these days? Okay, it's Palm Sunday. Jesus is coming triumphantly into Jerusalem. People all along the way are shouting, Hosanna to the Son of David, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. The disciples are walking in and saying, that's my rabbi, So on a scale of 1 to 10, you're one of the disciples. Where are you? We're right up there at the top, right? Palm Sunday, okay? Now, that night, Jesus says, we can't stay in the city. Can't stay in Jerusalem. Because the chief priests and the leaders of the people want to kill me. They're going to nail me to a cross and kill me. So we have to go and hide. Which direction are you going? Up or down as a disciple? Okay? We're headed down. All through this week, Jesus is saying to his disciples the same thing I just mentioned. It's just, they're going to kill me. We have to hide, and they can see the chief priests, and they're talking to the temple guard and things like that, and maybe they've got some inkling even of Judas about to betray them. All through this week, things are getting worse. And actually, by the time we get to Thursday night, Jesus has this very sorrowful Passover meal with them and says, this is it, guys. It's over. So by Thursday night, Judas has betrayed Jesus, and by Friday, he's dead on the cross. And Saturday, he's buried. You notice I've gone below 0 here. That's where the disciples are. And then Sunday, he shows up again, alive. He says, check me out. Here I am. Okay? It's not hard to picture what happens on Sunday. we go off and chart that direction, right? But what happens on Monday? Thomas shows up. He wasn't there that first night. He says, I don't believe it. You guys are victims of mass hysteria. You're just believing what you want to believe. Unless I see him with my own eyes, unless I can put my fingers in the nail prints and put my hand into his side, I'm not going to believe. Now, I don't think that Thomas was able to drag them very far down, but he, I'm sure, dragged them down. And when does Jesus show up again? Sunday. This time Thomas does believe. You see a little pattern emerging here? If we push this pattern out to another Sunday, and here we're going to put a Thursday in. This is the Thursday that Jesus ascended into heaven and left the disciples behind. I'm thinking that, and he told them to wait for the promised Holy Spirit. Again, you know, they're pretty high on the chart, but every day it's kind of dragging them down a little bit. What's going to happen? Why are we waiting here? All of this. And what happens? The day of Pentecost fully comes. Sunday, 3,000 people join the church, all the speaking tongues, all that kind of stuff. When Lisa and I got married, on June the 23rd, 1979, we were very happy, and we celebrated our first anniversary. The next Saturday. We've been married a whole week, yay, this is so cool. And we did that for several weeks, and then on July the 23rd, we've been married for a whole month. Wow, this is so cool, our first anniversary. You know, we celebrated monthly anniversaries for a while. And then our first anniversary, we've been married a whole year, you know. We don't celebrate Saturdays anymore. We don't celebrate the 23rds of every month anymore. Sometimes we forget June 23rd, you know, the big, you know, the fives, you know. We got another one coming up at 30 here next year. Somehow, you know, kind of lose the excitement in there. But not the Christian church. We're still celebrating the Sundays. We've celebrated over 100,000 weekly anniversaries of Jesus rising from the dead. That's the big one. And we're still doing that. That's the day, the one day in seven, that the church has chosen to use in its celebration of the commandment, in its keeping of the commandment, the one day in seven, that's the first day of the week, that's the day that Jesus rose from the dead. And that's what we still do. Now, the combination of worship with rest is connected up with the promise of heaven. What we do to keep the Sabbath, to keep that rest, is we get together and encourage one another and praise God for the perfect, complete, final rest that the Bible in the book of Hebrews calls the Sabbath rest, that is heaven. So again, we could spend a lot more time on this, but I just want to give you just a basic outline of how this commandment connects up with us who worship on Sunday and celebrate it on Sunday rather than, you know. So in other words, we don't pick the day that the calendar calls the seventh day, 1 through 7. In fact, you know, if you did that, most of you on your computers see calendars that start on Monday, right? If you have Outlook and you don't set it to start the first day of the week on Sunday, it starts on Monday, and Sunday does wind up being the seventh day. But who cares how human beings mark their calendar days? For us, the important thing is 1 out of 7 is worship and praise, and is cessation from our labors,
We take a rest. We are designed by God to rest one day out of 7. And when we don't, you know what happens. What happens is you get less effective. Sure, you may be working 7 days a week, but you're only working at 80% of your capacity because you're so worn out and exhausted. Do the math. 7 days, 80%, you're getting 5.6 days worth of work done. As opposed to if you work 6 days at 100%, you got 6 days worth of work done. It doesn't even work. In other words, when we try to outfox God and do something different than what He wants, it doesn't even work. We drop below where we would be if we just did it His way. So, all right. Well, again, we're going to take a little break and spend a little time getting to know each other better, and we'll pick back up in a minute.